Kara, let's start with Facebook says Trump could come back if he is not a safety threat anymore. But extremist groups are still out there. How would Facebook even be able to tell if the threat is gone?
Well, I think they're focused on President Trump and the things he says, such as the election lies that he kept talking about, election fraud lies. And so I think they're watching his behavior elsewhere and to see if he continues to push forward on a lot of stuff. I think right after he was suspended from Facebook for an indefinite period of time, he continued to sort of double down on the things he was saying that were a problem for Facebook. So I think it's his behavior is what they're looking at, not necessarily public safety, is whether his presence on social media will be safe, I suspect.
Kara, you know Mark Zuckerberg very, very well. Does he truly believe that Facebook users will just magically moderate themselves?
He does. You know, I haven't talked to him in a while. He hasn't been talking to me since our last interview where he said some things that weren't great for him to say about Holocaust deniers, but from knowing him for the many years, he really truly believes in the community and its ability to self-regulate. And if not, that they can use algorithms to take care of the rest. But one of the things he always used to say, and I at first I thought it was sort of a feint and not very real, but I do think he believes it, is that the community together will decide on what's right and what's wrong, and that he shouldn't. This has been something he's maintained for a long time, which I think has become untenable when you have a character like Donald Trump show up. And so, you know, you could call Donald Trump an outlier or whatever you want, but they haven't been able to handle how to deal with a bad player who continues to game them, essentially.
Well, yesterday, Nick Clegg was actually asked about your column, and he said Facebook should be regulated, but not broken up. Hasn't their massive resistance and enormous lobbying efforts in D.C., resistance to regulation, exactly led us to the mess that we're in now?
Well, there's no regulation. So they're not resistant to regulation. It's a question of what regulation should be. And of course, they don't want the wrong kind of regulation that they wouldn't like. And one of the issues is whether they should be broken up, whether they have a stranglehold on social media, whether they're too much of a even Clarence Thomas was talking about the idea of whether they should become a public utility. Now, those are all interesting things to debate, and everybody should talk about them. But I think probably what's going to happen is more crackdowns on their issues around privacy and data. That's a good place to begin, and there's a lot of bills, including by Senator Amy Klobuchar and others, that have been trying to focus on this. There's more of an ability of the FTC and the Justice Department to have funding to enforce a lot of stuff. That's the very beginnings of things. And then we have to think really hard about these sort of monopolies that really do determine what everybody can do. And one of the things is whether you agree or not with their decision on Donald Trump. One person made that decision. I know that Nick Clegg uses the word we a lot, but it really comes down to Mark Zuckerberg.
I don't know too many of the richest people on the planet who run public utilities. How much political will is there really to break Facebook up?
You know, I think it depends on where you are on the political spectrum. I mean, a lot of on both sides of the aisle, they do think about the power a lot. Now, the Republicans are sort of focused in on sort of the Josh Hawley idea that they're somehow biased against conservatives. They're not. The problem is President Trump violated the rules of Facebook over and over and over again. And they actually were quite indulgent of him until the insurrection. And then, as I've said before, they didn't feel like being handmaidens to sedition. And that's really what they had been. And that's why Twitter permanently banned him. And then Facebook moved to indefinitely ban him. And now they're going to do it for 2 years. I think they're sort of kicking the can down the road. You know, I think there's a lot of appetite to do something here. And whether it's going to be a breakup, which takes a long time and is a very slow and onerous process, or whatever.